Good afternoon, everybody. I am Johanna Ulloa Giron, and I work at the Community Service Department at the Poudre River Public Library District. And we welcome you today. We're very excited. Today is our last installment of our series, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Why Allyship in Action. I want to take a second to really thank Heather. We are so thankful for your support, for your words, for your knowledge. And we are so thankful and lucky to have you and have us walk with us through these 4 weeks. For all of you who are here for the 4 weeks, it will be 8 hours that you have participated in this series. And that says a lot. Thank you so much for trusting us and for being with us. Seems like I'm having really bad echo. So I guess without further ado, I'll introduce Heather.
Thank you, Johanna. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be back with you all for our final session together. I'm going to share my screen so that we can start with the conversation that I have prepared for today, but also want to make sure that we touch on just a couple of logistical things. So just as a reminder for folks who would like to see me talking, just make sure that you have your view on dual view, which you can do if you go up to the top of the screen and hit the 3 buttons. You can kind of see the presentation as well as see me. And then you're able to use the chat box for any comments or reflections that you have. And then if you have any questions, we'd love for you to use the Q&A. I just want to do a brief introduction of myself for anyone that might be new here. So my name is Heather Arnold-Renicker. I am a clinical assistant faculty member at the University of Denver. I teach in the Graduate School of Social Work, and I teach anti-oppressive social work practice as well as policy, administration, leadership, management, and all of those things. I've been doing organizational consulting work and anti-oppression work for about 20 years. And have been involved in lots of different aspects of anti-oppression work, which is what brought me here with you all during this 4-session time frame. So I'm excited to be wrapping it up with you all today and sharing some conversations about allyship and action as our last piece together. So again, just a reminder for folks, use the chat for any comments or reflections or sharing that you have. We did do some homework between sessions, and so I usually ask folks to share some reflections from that process. That would go in the chat box. Any questions you want me to respond to can go in the Q&A, which will just help me keep track of where those things are sitting. There will be a recording of this, and it will be sent out to folks who would like to view it later if you have to leave early or would like to share it with anyone. And then again, we will have the option for Q&A along the way, and I will try to keep an eye on that as I'm talking to make sure I catch your questions. I do just want to do, again, an Indigenous land acknowledgement, which we've done every time, just to continue to acknowledge that we exist on stolen lands. So I currently reside in Arvada, which is the land of the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Ute tribes. And then Fort Collins has Arapaho, which is also sort of spread across the state of Colorado. These are the community agreements that we came up with, or that I shared with folks at the very beginning of the time that we had together. And just wanted to reiterate these for folks that might be new. So really just agree to be here and work against all of these things that we're sort of trying to fight against in ourselves and in the world. We know that no space can really be completely safe. And so reminding that we will do our best for harm reduction and just being really respectful in our engagement together. That includes in the chat, just using respectful language and respectful questions, etc. Sit in discomfort that we know comes with having some of these conversations. And as we move into a conversation about allyship, there might be some discomfort in just trying to think about what it is that allyship means and what it means for us to show up for racial justice. And then try our best not to shame ourselves for the vulnerability that's required in these kinds of conversations. So recognizing that sometimes in discussing these things, we can feel a lot of guilt and shame, and those are normal human feelings. And so we'll talk a little bit today about what do we do with that as we try to move forward in doing this work. value viewpoints of other people that don't conflict with our right to exist, and it's okay to have feelings and feel uncomfortable when we're discussing difficult subject matter. So just reiterating those for us again together. I wanted to start today with a quote. So I've been starting every session with a particular quote that I find useful for that subject matter for the day. And today is from Lila Watson, who is an Aboriginal elder. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. And this really sort of encompasses the perspective of the conversation we're going to have today about allyship and the importance of understanding that there is a mutual shared experience in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, that all of us can't be free until we all are free. And so how do we figure out a way to kind of work towards that and see it as less of a helping thing and more as a solidarity action. So we're going to talk more about what that means today. I just want to revisit the homework. So what I asked folks to do last week was to pick one element of white supremacy culture and spend the week just kind of thinking about planning for how you might disrupt this in yourself and your organization, your practices, policies, and behaviors. We also offered some allyship articles to read in preparation for today, and I'm going to review some of the themes from these articles. So if for whatever reason you didn't get to this homework, or you were someone who's new this time around and weren't with us last week, I will touch on some of the themes that showed up in these articles. And then to come today with any last questions or remaining thoughts that you have about future conversations with regard to showing up for racial justice. So I would love if folks who did participate in the homework, if you would put in the chat just some of your reflections, if you did spend time thinking about an aspect of white supremacy culture that you were going to try to disrupt, or any thoughts that you had about the readings, reflections on going through those and some of the concepts that were put out in those readings. If you feel like you want to share, please do in the chat box, and I will comment on some of those reflections. So I'll pause for just 1 second as folks are considering if you have something you'd like to put in the chat. We have somebody who wrote urgency, trying to slow down and acknowledge how this trait impacts folks. So last week we talked about this sense of urgency and always the need to kind of rush and do things quickly and get them done now, which causes us to not pause and really think about the impact of that on individuals who are impacted by our decisions. So that could be a constituency group, it could be a community, certainly our staff, if we work in an organization, our congregation, if we're, in sort of a religious institution. And so what does it mean to sort of pause and take more time and intention as opposed to being rushed and looking at it from an urgency perspective? So thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts or reflections about pieces of white supremacy culture or allyship? Another comment in the chat says, I found the breakdown of the elements of white supremacy allowed me to at last understand the change I need to embrace. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. Perfection and urgency. This person says, I work in atmospheric science research as a researcher, but also as someone who strives to increase the participation of underrepresented groups. The issues of perfection and urgency as a barrier to this participation actually came up in a meeting this week about how these characteristics work against increased participation. Thank you. Yeah. And I think that it's important to remember that these don't just show up. So the organization, the white supremacy culture conversation we had was really framed primarily in a context of organizational culture and often thinking about nonprofits, but it certainly shows up in many, many spaces. Where I think we can look at the themes of culture and white dominant culture and how those play out. There was someone who mentions like filling out a ballot and just fought a sense of urgency to complete the ballot with the info given and felt like there was not enough info for the school board, and so emailed both candidates to sort out sort of what candidate might be better fit. That's a great example of urgency, when we rush to kind of try to do something and don't take the time to really think about the impact of that decision. So yeah. My library is working on its new strategic plan, and I think we need to really thoughtful language on working to overcome the racism that is embedded in our existence as part of our existence as a taxpayer-funded entity. Thank you. Being open to conflict is really difficult for me. In my occupation, politeness was prized. This is something I can disrupt by listening and realizing that these conversations are vital to making connections. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I think that that piece of conflict is such a big one that's been coming up for me a lot this week. I've been dealing with many things in the last probably 3 days where I've been noticing around colleagues and friends and people in my life who are in a position to be allies are really struggling with this conflict piece of lacking comfort with it, feeling really complicated around how to engage with conflict. And so I think that's one that we really do have to look into in terms of what is our tendency towards conflict, and how does that intersect with our fear and sometimes unwillingness to have difficult conversations about some of these things. Another person mentions, I found that anecdotes really helpful. I think it can be difficult to see those elements, and the anecdotes really help me see the problem and think about solutions. Yes. Yes, thank you for saying that. I think that initially the document did not have anecdotes, and so they went back and came up with some suggestions for how to change those things, because I agree it can be very difficult to know what to do differently. And we have another comment. I'm a graduate student, and while my department has been discussing the importance of improving diversity, the conversation on white supremacy actually highlighted for me the many ways they are furthering a white supremacy agenda: perfectionism, quantity versus quality, urgency, power hoarding. I feel a little overwhelmed in thinking about how to disrupt all these, but I'm planning to address this list with our department head to see how we might begin to shift some of the cultural issues. Quality versus quantity feels like a good place to start, getting the department to measure the quality of experience by faculty, staff, and students. Yeah, thank you so much. I for sure experience that in higher education. I think it's the quality versus quantity question is really strong in higher education for sure. Thank you for saying that. I wanted to also mention that I got an email from one of our participants who I really appreciated reaching out, and she expressed that that I wasn't clear in distinguishing the conversation that we were having about reverse racism, and I brought up Dr. Kendi talking about issues of power, and I didn't clearly distinguish between my ideas to make it clear that I was not equating reverse racism with anything that Dr. Kendi is saying. So I wanted to come back and just clarify that for folks and say that the question that was brought up in the chat was, reverse racism isn't a thing, right? Like, make sure, I'm just checking. And what I started to talk about was how Dr. Kendi talks about how when we discuss racism as a function of white people having aspects of systemic power, we sometimes negate the power that people of color do have access to, and Black folks in particular. But that doesn't, I was not in any way intending to equate his statement there with reverse racism. I think what I was trying to articulate and didn't make a clear distinction between is that I think it's really important that when we define racism as systemic power, that we also are not simultaneously disempowering communities of color, and that we acknowledge that there is a unique power structure, which Dr. Kendi agrees with, that white folks have a systemic power that is that allows for sort of overarching policies to be made, ideological narratives to be perpetuated, and cultural narratives to be perpetuated in a way that that often communities of color don't have whole-scale access to. And yet communities of color do have forms of power that are really important to acknowledge. So I just wanted to revisit that and make sure that I was clarifying that I wasn't making the connection between those two things, even though that's the way it might have come off for folks, especially if people are not familiar with his work. So just holding myself accountable to that, and really appreciate the email response for clarification, and wanting to be clear about what my impact was and what my intention was. So I'm coming back to revisit that. Okay, so we are going to talk today about allyship, and I really appreciate everybody kind of engaging with the homework and really taking the time in between sessions to do this. I know that it's been a little funny in this format, not being able to see each other's faces or to be able to chat with each other. And part of that is the protection, because we know that there are folks in community who have been intentionally and very in horrifying ways disrupting conversations about racism lately. And so and then we ran into some challenges around creating a new meeting and having the ability to facilitate small groups with such a large group of folks, because we have about 113 people on this call. And so so I really appreciate you still engaging, even though I know webinars aren't as interactive as I normally do. I usually teach in very interactive ways. So I so appreciate all of you to come in and continue to engage with us. So thank you so much for being here and sticking with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about allyship today, and then we have a panel. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the agenda so you can see. So we're going to talk about allyship in action and have a conversation about what allyship looks like or doesn't look like and some of the complexities within that. And then we invited some folks from the community, from the BIPOC Alliance and the library, to talk about what allyship looks like in the Fort Collins area. And so we're hoping to have a panel around 3:15-ish to have folks who are engaged in the community in Fort Collins to talk a little bit about their work and the BIPOC Alliance, and then just organizing in general, and then hear a little bit about what allyship might look like in the city. So we'll get to that a little bit later, and really appreciate the folks who volunteered their time for that. So, so in talking about allyship, I want you to just think about what allyship means to you. There's a lot of conversation about this word and the meaning behind it, and people have lots of feelings about allyship for lots of reasons. And so I want you to just think for 1 second about, what does allyship mean to you? And if you feel comfortable putting a word or a sentence in the chat about what that word means. And it can mean anything. I'm not looking for a specific answer, just asking you to think about, what does it actually mean to you? So feel free to add things in the chat. Walk together, I see. Supporting, standing by someone's side, listening, and not hearing. Okay. Partnering, I have your back. Listening to BIPOC, considering what they say, continue to learn. Present and supportive, partner to shift the power balance. Shared humanity. Commitment without performative virtue. Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Not stereotyping, share resources, being authentic, plus everything already said, speaking up when asked, amplifying silenced or muted voices. Yeah, great. Getting permission to be supportive. Yeah. All really great. Thank you for sharing those things. Standing up for another person without the other person knowing it. Yeah, so what do we do when we're not necessarily in the presence of the community we're in solidarity with? How do we act when no one's watching? Bringing unity one at a time. Great. So one of the definitions from one of the readings that I shared for homework is an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and re-evaluating, in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. So this definition I like because it brings in sort of the active, not the passive aspect of allyship, that it's not something that we just sort of arrive at and then stop working toward. It's something that's active, consistent, and it is sometimes arduous. It can just be a lot to try to figure out how to navigate some of those spaces and do them with intention and thoughtfulness, because we're sort of oriented to not do that, right? Especially when we're thinking about it from a privileged perspective. We're not really socialized and ingrained in a culture that allows us the opportunity to do this easily. It feels more complicated and challenging at times. And someone in the chat says, we don't choose to be an ally, our BIPOC partners decide if we are a true ally. Yes, we're going to touch on that too. So that's this next piece. Thank you for setting up this next part, which is allyship is not an identity. It is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. So again, going back to a conversation I think we had, I think it might have been the second week, where I talked about it's not something that we just sort of claim for ourselves. It's something that we have to earn every day, all day long, in every action that we take. And I think for some folks that can feel like a bit overwhelming to think about in terms of the amount of intention and energy it takes when we're used to going about our day and just kind of doing what we do. But we know that when we do that, without that intention, we sort of default to what we're conditioned around, which if we go back to last week, and even the previous week, is around fragility and difficulty engaging in complicated conversations, fear of conflict, you know, a sense of urgency, which then ultimately means sometimes voices are left out, or often voices are left out. And so, so when we engage in allyship, it's something we have to be intentional and thoughtful about all of the time. And I think sometimes allyship has been positioned as though it's something that we can just do and be, as opposed to something we actively work toward every day in every decision that we make. Allyship is not self-defined. Your work and your efforts must be recognized by the people you seek to ally yourselves with, right? So you have to earn that. You earn it through your actions and your behaviors and the building of relationships and trust. It's not something that just sort of happens. And it certainly can look different depending on the relationship and the person and their perspective on their own identity in the world. And so allyship isn't something that looks the same for everyone, which is also, I think, touched on in that arduous piece, which is like, it requires you to show up and be in relationship to folks and really understand what allyship or behaviors look like for those folks and those individuals, right? Because it can be different depending on who that person is and where they're positioned. And then allyship is being willing to have your mistakes. This one was not in the reading, but I added it because I have had a couple of examples in the last 24 hours where folks have been engaging in behaviors that are problematic, and because they're not public, they can hide behind them. And so I think allyship is really about being willing to let your mistakes come to light and for you to own them and apologize and change your behavior. That hiding behind things because we know that there might not be people who can see what's happening is still a problem and not considered allyship behavior. And so when we even when things are happening and we don't necessarily think that everyone knows that they're happening, how do we hold ourselves accountable to the things that we believe in and the values that we hold around working towards racial justice so that we are really being true to those values and showing up. And one of the things about allyship that I think is really important to acknowledge is that just looking on the internet will give you lists upon lists of things to do and not do, right? As an ally. So 75 things that you can do as an ally, 5 steps to becoming to an ally. And if only it were that simple. So lists can be really helpful to us in having an overall sense of themes or how we might want to engage in this work, but we can't really rely on lists to help us do this lifelong practice because it requires complicated navigation of challenging situations that lists won't help you with. So they're really helpful with themes and sort of general concepts and ideas, but remembering that if you're in a situation where you're trying to figure out what to do, sometimes looking at those lists is not going to give you that answer. And really often it won't give you that answer because human relationships and context and circumstances are more complex than just sort of a bullet pointed list. And I think sometimes we find comfort in those because it feels like there's an answer. And so we look to that as a way to kind of help us know the right thing to do. But in reality, we can kind of have to work through it and through that process, make mistakes and figure out how to do better every time. And that feels hard because the risk, right, is high. It's not a low stakes kind of situation. You know that mistakes potentially mean that you're causing someone or a group harm. And for most people, that feels really hard. There's very few people that I know who do things intentionally to harm others. There certainly are those people, as we know, but most people are really trying. And so it's hard to admit when those mistakes happen and that you had a negative impact on someone. So we're going to keep talking about this a little bit. So allyship is about integrity. So having alignment between what you say you will do and what you actually do. And this is something, so I worked with an organization in Washington, D.C. that was a startup, and they were a parent membership organization. And they were talking to me about, like, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that organizations make? And one of the ones I said was, organizations are not honest about what they can and can't do. So they put out there this perspective of we're inclusive and we're doing all of this work. And then when people join that organization to work there, or they join that community group to be a part of it, they realize that that's not the case. And it feels more harmful than just like an honest statement about what is possible or not possible. So I think some of it is about this idea around integrity and being really true to what you say you're going to do, and owning when you can't follow up on that, owning when you can't meet those expectations, and recognizing the harm that that does and apologizing for it and doing better. But I think this discrepancy between what we say and what we do has, I've seen, been really, really harmful to the trust building process, to the racial justice movement, and to just progress towards, you know, liberation for everyone. So so that integrity piece, I think, is really, really important. And then, you know, related to that is and when you make a mistake, which you're going to make a mistake. We all make mistakes. We're human beings, and we don't know everything, and we can't know everything. And even if we've been doing this work forever and are experts, you know, on a subject matter related to it historically or whatever, policy experts, anything like that, we can still make mistakes. And so how do we own those, apologize, and work to rebuild the trust, and then move on? But in moving on, actually change your behaviors, and not continue to do the same thing over and over and over again, because that then demonstrates that the intention and the real value and true commitment to this work isn't there. And that's when trust erodes, and it becomes much more challenging to move past that place when you're not demonstrating that you're willing to make a shift. Also really thinking about your actions being accountable to people of color-led efforts. So don't act without ensuring that your actions will not cause more harm for BIPOC folks in your community or your organization. And this is true across any kind of allyship. You want to be really careful that even with the best of intentions, you might do something that causes harm because you didn't know for sure that it was the right thing to do, or that it was, you know, something that would be helpful to that particular person or that community or constituency. And so how do you make sure that you're acting and trying to make change, but you also have relationships and are accountable to folks who are telling your community or you as an individual what's needed? And so I have an example of that that's not race related, but is about trans inclusion, which I think I might have mentioned one of the first times we chatted, which is that I worked with an organization and we wrote a trans inclusion health handbook for the HR department in the organization around accessibility in office space and bathrooms and health insurance and all this stuff. And it was with the best of intentions, but there were only 2 trans people in this organization of 150 people. And so when we put out that handbook, what we did not think about, because we didn't have enough accountability with the folks in the organization and elsewhere who were identifying as trans folks at the time, was that people in the organization then went to the only trans people in the organization, started asking them like, oh, do you feel uncomfortable here? Are you okay using the bathroom in our office space? You know, what do you think about this? How do you feel? And so it put those folks who experience the marginalization on the spot to have to speak for themselves and for everyone else who might have a similar or same experience as them. And we just didn't think about that. And so it was one of those situations where we didn't really have enough accountability to know that there should have been some steps done prior to the action that we took. And someone in the chat said, would you call that tokenism? So yes, going to the people and asking them about their experience, especially when you don't have any relationship with that person, is tokenism. You're essentially going and saying, like, I want you to speak on behalf of all people who are part of a marginalized group that you represent or that you align yourself with, and tell me how that feels. Which is, you know, it's also just setting folks up to tell a story about themselves they may not trust you with or want to share. And so how do we think about the accountability piece as being really important? We also know that there's sometimes we engage in actions or behaviors that disproportionately impact people of color. So if we look at marches and people who engage in violent behavior in marches who are some of those folks are intentionally doing it, right, to cause harm, and that's one thing. But I think that there are other folks who go and engage in that process of marching and doing sort of violent protests because they think, you know, police are dangerous and we want to fight against the police and we don't believe in the police. But they don't think about the fact that when you incite violence like that, it's not coming back at the white folks in the audience or in the protest, it's coming back at the people of color. And so sometimes we engage in actions that we think are coming from a good place, but we don't think about the impact of those actions on the most impacted people. And that's partly due to a lack of relationship and accountability. And so there's lots of examples that I'm sure folks can think of where this has happened, where even people with good intentions end up doing harm because that relationship doesn't exist and there's not, or it's weak, or there's just not a communication process there in terms of, like, does this action actually lead towards things that you are seeking, as opposed to, you know, being sort of performative and self-aggrandizing, which we'll talk about too. And someone in the chat asks, are relationships the key element for balancing the need for not asking, quote, and not asking Black people to tell us what we need to do, and quote, not acting without ensuring that your actions will not cause more harm for BIPOC folks? It's sometimes hard to understand when to step back from educating ourselves and solicit feedback from BIPOC and other marginalized groups. Yeah. Yes, so relationships are a really big part of this. So some of it is what existing relationships do you have? So I do work with the National Surge work, showing up for racial justice, and did local work for a long time here in Denver with that organization. And one of the things that Surge tells all of the chapters across the United States, which are chapters that are primarily focused at organizing white people for racial justice, is start where you have relationships. So think about, what relationships do you have to organizations led by folks of color? What relationships do you have to folks who are in organizing work already? And how can you reach out to those folks and say, I am interested in moving this work forward, and I want to be accountable for that, and do it in a way that that is thoughtful and responsible. And then branch out from there. And once you start showing up, then you can build more relationships because people see you showing up and continuously standing up for things and standing in solidarity with folks in the fight. And so there is this balance, like, you know, I have really close relationships with folks in my life who I know that we have a relationship, and I know that I could reach out to them and check on some of the things that I'm doing and make sure that they are okay. And I also know that there are some things that it's not their job to talk to me about. And so I find other spaces to process that information. And so it is a little bit of navigation of, like, what are those relationships, and how can you really, like, foster those relationships so that when you do want to engage in action, you actually know what's going to be helpful. And some of that is just looking towards organizations that are publicly saying, you know, the movement for Black Lives nationally, our sanctuary work locally, folks are saying what's helpful and what they need people to do in showing up. And so there's very public examples too, where the relationship doesn't have to be going and asking someone to educate you, but there's a public demonstration of, like, here's what we want you to do. Here are 10 things that we need you to do. Call your senators, write letters, you know, show up, find data on your local police departments, all of those things that that you can do without necessarily asking someone to tell you how to move forward on that. And I missed a question in the chat, or in the Q&A. Someone said, could you give an example of what accountability might have looked like in the transgender HR project you referenced? Well, I think that yes, it's a great question. Some of what we should have done is thought about how to, so we didn't have a conversation with the organization in the first place about trans inclusion and why it was important. So essentially, like out of the blue, they sort of received this, this sort of HR pamphlet that talked about things without actually even talking to the organization in general about what it meant to have an organization that's inclusive of trans folks. And so I think some of it was an education piece that accountability would have been thinking about what it meant to talk to the organization about why this was happening and why it was important to the organization. And then I think the other part of that is utilizing relationships within the organization to say, like, this is something we're thinking of doing, and we want to ask folks if you have feedback about this process or you want to be involved in the process to reach out to us, and we will talk with you about that. So opening it up broadly to folks, like who wants to be a part of this process? Are there any concerns or questions, not just from the trans people who are in the organization, but from everyone that exists there, so that we could determine what questions might come up and have a better sense of how the organization would receive it, and get a clear picture of the culture of the organization for the folks that were marginalized in that circumstance. So I think some of it is about being thoughtful and sort of anticipating, because you can generally anticipate what some of the reaction might look like if you pause for a second and kind of remove yourself from that sense of urgency and really think about what could happen here, and how do I move forward with intention and thoughtfulness about the possible and unintended consequences. And then the last piece of this is engage in constant self-reflection, education, and resource gathering. So get involved in movement spaces and organizing efforts in your area focused on doing the work to end racial injustice, but decenter yourself in that work. It's not about you. So this goes back to that question about accountability and balancing relationships. If you're engaged in the work, if you're reading up on things, if you're following movement leaders on social media, or even, like email newsletters, and many organizations communicate in multiple ways. So if you're not someone who uses social media, you can find that information, websites. Once you're involved, you learn about, like, what are folks asking for? How are they asking people to show up? What are they saying is going to be helpful right now? So if we're talking about it from a movement perspective, you can do it that way. If we're talking about it from an organizational perspective, a lot of it is about, like, building relationships with folks and getting involved in the issue area that you're focused on, and any kind of racial justice movements that are happening around your issue area. So if you're working in child welfare, for example, what is the space around racial justice and child welfare? How can you involve yourself in that space to better understand the nuances of that conversation, and the folks who are advocating for change in that arena? So really thinking about, like, what is the area where you are involved the most, and how can you figure out how to sort of get yourself into a space of education and reflection and engagement. And then decentering yourself in that work really means, like, stepping back and letting other folks lead, and listening and being really clear that you are not the expert in that space. And even if you have experience, even if you're someone who knows a lot of things, letting folks who are most impacted, and in this case, we're talking about BIPOC folks, Black and Indigenous people of color, lead. And the assumption, right, when we come back to this idea of paternalism, is, like, just our history has been that certain groups of people, privileged folks, whether it's wealthy people, men, white folks, etc., know more. That is the sort of cultural narrative that we exist within, and that paternalism really causes us to show up in spaces centering ourselves, rather than stepping back and realizing, like, I'm not here to lead, I'm here to learn, and I'm here to step into a space to be in solidarity when I'm asked, but only when I'm asked, and figuring out how to do the work simultaneously, on my own. And I think it's complicated. It is. You're definitely going to step into something at some point. And I think the best thing then is to just appreciate that someone gave you feedback and move forward, similar to what we talked about when talking about fragility. someone says in the chat, I stepped into this area in the theater world without first learning what the conversation looks like there. Huge mistake. Yeah, right. Just kind of figuring out what's going on and learn and sit back a little bit and listen and witness what's going on and recognize that there's a wealth of knowledge and experience and information in communities who are most impacted by racial injustice. And they should be leading because they are the experts of their experience. And we really should be there as a support system and a resource gatherer and all of those things that have demonstrated, you know, to be useful in efforts historically and presently. So we're just going to touch on a couple of other things before taking a break and moving into a panel conversation. So this came from the reading, and I just want to come back and talk a little bit about some of the highlights that came out of it. So they were, in the reading, they were talking about how, what allies do, like what is the behavior and sort of perspective of allyship. And so we actively acknowledge our privilege and power and openly discuss them. So we recognize that as recipients of privilege, we will always be capable of perpetuating systems of oppression, and just being willing to own that and not feel so afraid of just saying it. We listen more and speak less. We do our work with integrity and direct communication. We do not expect to be educated by others. We build our capacity to receive criticism. We embrace the emotions that come out of the process of allyship and seek relationships with other white people doing this work to process and deal with these emotions. Our needs are secondary to the people we seek to work with. We do not expect awards or special recognition. And I want to say something about this, like we do not expect to be educated by others, because I get a lot of questions about that. And I will say to you that, like, I, for many years of my life, have spent, just built relationships with folks of color in my life. It wasn't like intentional, because the goal wasn't for me to be like, oh, I need to have someone of color in my life. Like, that's not what I was doing. But I just built relationships with folks who I was working with, or I was in community with, or organizing with. And as a result of being in relationship with these folks, like in my life, I just witnessed what they were experiencing. No one had to tell me anything. I didn't have to ask them to educate me. I was in their lives enough to see what was happening every day and to witness the marginalization and the microaggressions and the racism that they were experiencing as a relationship, in relationship to them. And this has happened over the course of my life in general, I think, but certainly over the course of my professional life, from the time that I was 18 years old, when I started doing this work and really seeing what it felt like for folks who are marginalized, whether it's, talking about racism or trans inclusion or other aspects of identity, class, education, citizenship, and listening to the stories of folks who are just friends and loved ones of mine. And so when we think about this education piece, a lot of times what is happening is that white people predominantly and very often only know mostly other white people, especially in terms of personal, deep relationships. And so as a result of that, because our communities are so homogeneous and we don't tend to branch outside of our own sort of comfort zone and where we grew up and who we know, we don't have relationships outside of ourselves. And as a result, we don't know enough about the experiences of folks from communities that are different from ours. And so we want this education piece because we aren't experiencing it in our daily lives, just through relationships with folks. And so that's a big piece of how I think it's important to think about, in your work, who do you tend to gravitate towards and build relationships with, and why? Who are the people you don't know as well, and why? How does that show up in your community? Who are the folks that you know in your community, and why? Where do you live, and how does that influence that? So all of those things really come into play when we think about how do we actually understand what's happening for folks if we aren't actually involved in daily experiences of people who are, bearing the brunt of our systemic and interpersonal issues that are existing around race and racism. We talked about, though, we build our capacity to receive criticism. So we talked about white fragility and some of the issues around resiliency. And this capacity to receive criticism might be therapy. It might be going to therapy or getting coaching around difficult conversations or conflict. It might be, you know, figuring out how to role play, like I mentioned in the two conversations ago. Is just like building up our capacity to be in a position where someone is giving us feedback, and how do we find resiliency around some of that. And then really this second to last one, our needs are secondary to the people we seek to work with. So really thinking about our discomfort, our fear, our sadness isn't centered here. It's not invalid and it's not irrelevant, but it's not important to center. And so how do we figure out where we can put all of those feelings and emotions so that they're appropriately dealt with? And we talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago, but I think coming back to that conversation about how is your community, friends, family, relationships, partners, whatever it is, open or not to engaging in this conversation, and how do you seek out a community that is? So that's why in between, I think it was sessions 2 and 3, I asked you to try to find some folks that you could talk to who are other white people who care about this issue. Because when you do something or when something happens, you're going to feel emotions, and that's totally normal. We're human, but where we deal with those emotions really matters. And so having someone or a group of people to go back to and say, hey, I just had an interaction that was really hard and I'm feeling really horrible. Can we talk about it? And can you hold me accountable for like next steps and actions and shifts in my behavior? And so building that instead of isolating is really, really important in ending this sort of perpetuation of white supremacy and sort of actions of racial injustice. Okay, so I want to touch on a couple things before we do take a break. So I want to talk about accomplice, because I know that there's probably folks on this call and conversation who are wondering why I haven't brought this up yet. And so there is a conversation about allyship versus accomplice, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the readings that has been written, but I can't recently have had a hard time finding it. The link did not work and it was not on the website. So I'm not sure what happened there, but there is an article about specifically talking about it from an Indigenous perspective, but talking about accomplices, not allies, and abolishing the ally industrial complex, which is essentially like talking about the popularity of allyship and how people are getting a lot of credit for being quote unquote allies without actually engaging in any of the behaviors that seek to create real lasting systemic change. And in the reading, there's just some highlights that I'll mention because I'm not entirely sure what happened to the full reading. But they talk about how accomplices listen with respect for the range of cultural practices and dynamics that exist within various Indigenous communities. And this certainly applies to other populations of folks of color. So just listening with respect for the different range of cultural communication and practices of and dynamics that exist within communities of color. Accomplices aren't motivated by personal guilt or shame. They may have their own agenda, but they are explicit if they do. So it's essentially saying that when we move beyond shame and guilt, we can be in a space of engaging in accomplice behavior where we're in solidarity with the movement and the work towards racial justice that isn't about ourselves. Because guilt and shame is about ourselves. It's about alleviating a feeling of guilt and shame. It's not about a bigger picture vision or, sort of solidarity and seeking liberation or freedom for folks. It's about feeling better about ourselves. And at some point we have to figure out how to move beyond that so that we can actually show up. Because otherwise when we do that, we center ourselves. We center our feelings, we center our needs or our discomfort rather than focusing really on what the work needs to look like. Accomplices are willing to risk something, not just sit in their comfort. So this one, and this reading is often challenging for like my students. When I give it to my students, I have to have a lot of conversation because it essentially talks about, the reading talks about giving land back to Indigenous communities. How do we return land? And that includes land that you have a home on, right? And a lot of folks can't start there. That feels like a lot to people who are new to this conversation to ask them to do something like that. And so when they talk about risk, they're saying, what are you risking? What are you really risking? And assessing actual risk versus perceived risk. So often we're afraid to act because we think that we're going to lose something important to us, but we have to remember that there's no neutral position, that not acting is a position, and that silence is a position. And so we have to assess actual risk, because sometimes there are actual risks. So that's different than perceived risk. And so sometimes, yes, we're really at risk, and sometimes we use the perception of risk to hide from something that's difficult or uncomfortable or challenging. So that could be a job, it could be a relationship, it could be access to financial security, it could be things that feel risky, they feel dangerous. And so what does that say for you? How do you actually assess whether or not you're risking something and standing up for some of the issues that we're seeing happening around racial injustice? Accomplices are realized through mutual consent and build trust. They don't just have our backs, they're at our side or in their own spaces confronting and unsettling colonialism. As accomplices, we are compelled to become accountable and responsible to each other. That's the nature of trust. So it's not just about having backs, it's at somebody's side and actually fighting alongside them, but also someone mentioned in the earlier in the chat about allyship. It's not just about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do when no one is there, or it's just two people, or you're in a room of power players who are, let's say you're with your board and it's mostly white men or white men and women, or, in an academic space where sometimes people are making choices who are very, very privileged. And so how do you think about what are you doing in the spaces when people aren't watching? And how do you stand up for things even when you're not getting the credit for it, which is a big part of that ally theater piece, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then the work of an accomplice in anti-colonial struggle is to attack colonial structures and ideas. So really thinking about what does that actually mean? We see this a lot, this conversation in education, decolonizing education, and the ways in which education perpetuates white supremacy. I don't know how many folks on the call watched Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, but last Sunday, his show was focused on talking about US history and the whitewashing of US history and the fear behind actually teaching our actual history, and that there are lots of ways in which we sort of hide behind a colonial story and a nationalistic story that's not accurate and based in the truth. So really thinking about that piece. Oh, great. And Rory shared the article to the Ally Industrial Complex. Thank you. I don't know what happened. It wasn't working for me the other day, so I appreciate that. So I want to talk a little bit about white saviorism and the Ally Industrial Complex just quickly before we move on to having a break and then the panel. And that's really just, I just want to point out what it is. So white saviorism is the practice of white people coming in and saving sort of the quote, poor people of color who need our help. So we see this a lot in Hollywood. So think of like The Blind Side and so many others. Like there's countless examples of this, right? Where white people come in and save. And then we also see it internationally. So a lot of times the Ally Industrial Complex and white saviorism are talked about in the context of international work. So missionary trips to Africa or South America and Central America, really thinking about what does it mean to kind of walk in and act like as white folks, as Westerners, in addition to white people. We believe that we have some moral obligation to save other people, and that we have the answers, and that the poor folks who we're trying to save don't know any better. So that paternalistic, very patronizing perspective is this white saviorism. I am a social worker in a social work profession. Social work has a very difficult complex around white saviorism. It's a lot about, we want to help people. And it's predominantly white women in social work. And so it's a lot of like, I'm here because I want to help people, as opposed to understanding like that there is a stake for all of us in this, that it's not just about helping, it's about solidarity and our own liberation in addition to everyone else's, and that there is something that everyone is losing when we perpetuate white supremacy. And so it's a lot about just seeing our struggle is tied up with and not like above someone else's. Someone asks, is being an accomplice better than being an ally? It's interesting because I don't have an answer to that. I would say people have different opinions. I think that there has been generally the conversation implies that the preference is that you are an accomplice because it implies that you risk something. And the reason for that is that allyship can be passive. So allyship can be like, well, I'm going to read a book and I'm going to care about these issues and I'm going to post on Facebook and I'm going to say something about this, but I'm not going to actually do anything about it. And so historically, allyship has been critiqued as very passive, and accomplice behavior has been lifted up as a little more active. And so it's less of a better than and more of a distinction between, that recognizing that allyship can be good if you are actually standing up for something and engaging in behaviors and actions that make change, as opposed to just like, I read a book and so therefore I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with reading books. It's really important to read books and get tools and skills and knowledge. Books are incredible for that, right? They open doors that we would never necessarily be able to open because we don't have those experiences, but we can't just stop there. And so that's the distinction between the two of them. And then the ally industrial complex I'll talk about in 1 second. So it's self-serving. It's about white person feeling good about doing something and not at all about what's actually needed to make real change. So this idea of charity versus justice. So I'm going to give you something to help. I'm going to, offer support, but I'm not going to actually stand with you or risk anything. So there's nothing wrong with offering resources, right? We hear a lot about that, the importance of reallocating resources. But it's also about understanding that that's not necessarily getting us towards justice unless it's sort of radical redistribution of wealth, which is like a whole nother conversation, right? But this idea of what are you doing something because it makes you feel good about doing something, or are you doing something because you see that there's a real change that needs to happen? It's paternalistic and comes from a place of, we know better, let us help you become more like us, and no community voices are involved in what's being done on their behalf. And it's performative. So white people want others to see what they are doing and acknowledge them for it publicly and visibly. So why? Thinking about, why are you doing this? Why are you posting this on Facebook or Instagram? Why are you claiming something? Why are you telling someone that you did something? What is the purpose behind that? And this is something that I think it can be really tough for folks because they want to be seen as allies. And so therefore they want to claim what they've been doing, but it's performative. You're acting because you want acknowledgement and you want to be seen as being a good person rather than just doing the work for the sake of the work. And sometimes it's not. It doesn't come with reward and acknowledgement. Sometimes it comes with really difficult, hard things. And so are you still willing to do it when that's the case, when you're not getting attention or kudos or rewarded or acknowledged for that? And so I think, so the ally industrial complex is really about how allyship has become this thing that people like want to do without actually making any particular change. So there was a really big critique about this back, I'm not gonna remember the year, somebody else might remember. I wanna say maybe around 2013, around the safety pin. So folks remember the safety pin, where people would wear a safety pin to claim that they are an ally for, I think it was for Muslim folks. And so in particular, but it was focused on allyship broadly. And so there was a lot of conversation about like wearing a safety pin does nothing, like it doesn't actually cause you to do anything, you don't have to risk anything, you just wear a safety pin. And there were other folks who were really like focused on like, oh, well, it's just a relief to see someone wearing one of those because I think maybe I'm okay if I'm around this person. So there was a lot of back and forth around that in terms of allyship, but generally the question was, is that actually allyship behavior, or is it just something that you can do that you can feel good about, but it doesn't actually result in any real change? And so someone in the chat's talking about industrial complex doesn't resonate. So we talk about this like the prison industrial complex, the nonprofit industrial complex, the ally industrial complex, which essentially is saying that people are funneling money and resources into a particular structure or system, but doesn't result in any real change. So if we look at the military industrial complex, it's sort of like we put so much money into our military, but it's at the expense of other things and caring for our community and all of those things. And it's in, you know, in service of a particular way of thinking about conflict and nationalism and power. The same is true for the nonprofit industrial complex. It's talking about how money and resources are funneled into nonprofit organizations that control the change that we see. So if funders aren't willing to make radical change, the organizations don't have the resources to do it, and therefore the change doesn't happen. So the same is true for ally industrial complex. It's sort of like pumping through a bunch of people who say that they're allies, but they're not engaged in any kind of behavior that actually shifts the root causes of the problems that we see around racial injustice and other aspects of oppression. And someone asked what if you are an influencer in your community and helping turn the tide of beliefs? Yeah, so if you are someone who holds like a powerful position and you want others to see what you're doing, it's different to model something than it is to say, I'm doing this. So if you're someone who's like modeling what you're doing, you're showing up at spaces, you're at protests, or you're at city council, or you're having conversations, you're at the community meetings and you're showing up, that to me is demonstrating. The performative part is if you're like telling everyone in your life, like, oh my gosh, you'll never believe what I did the other day. I was at the march and it was so cool, and I got to wear a pink hat and it was so great. You know, when you're sort of performing it to get some result that's about like giving you credit for it, as opposed to saying, I'm just showing up and I'm just doing the work. I'm not doing it so that I can tell you about it. So there's a little bit of a distinction there that I think you probably have seen, certainly in terms of people on social media, in terms of like, what are they saying and why? It doesn't mean you shouldn't articulate what you're doing, because it might invite other people into it. But I think before you do something like that, think about, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I think it's going to make me look good? Or am I doing it because I genuinely want people to join me in engaging in this work? And the only way I can think about inviting them in is by telling them what I'm doing. Someone in the chat said difference between bragging and being humble. Absolutely. It's about sort of saying like, I'm going to go to this march. Does someone want to join me? You know, I'm going to create, like, I'm going to have a caravan. I mean, obviously now with COVID, that's more complicated, but you know what I mean? Like, do you want to join me in a session on, you know, a 4-part session on whiteness and showing up for racial justice? Like, come join me and I'll send you the link. That's different than like, well, here's what I said the other day to someone who, you know, was saying something that was racist, and then posting it on Facebook and like waiting for people to respond to you and tell you what a great job you did. Those things, while it's okay to do that, right, to stand up for something, why you're posting it or why you're sharing it is that fundamental piece of performing. What is the theater part of it, or the performance part of it? Someone is saying the distinction between modeling and saying. Sometimes you're telling it because you don't want to say join me, but want to give them the opportunity. Yeah, so much to criticize. I appreciate your lessons. Yeah. Yeah, and I've had to think about this a lot too, y'all. Like, I'm not sitting over here being like, oh, I'm perfect. I've had to think, like, what am I doing now? Am I writing this on Facebook because I want people to join me? Why am I expressing this here? What is the purpose of it? And really thinking about, what is it? Where is it coming from? So I want to make sure that we're a little bit over time in terms of the time I wanted to give us for a break, but I want to make sure we have enough time for our panel. So I'm going to stop my share, and we're going to take a little bit of a break and give you an opportunity to stretch and get something to drink or use the restroom or whatever you need to do before we start. So it's probably going to be about 7-minute break. So we'll come back at about 3:15 and check in with you all and start the conversation with the panelists. All right. Hi, everyone. We're back. I wanted to just touch on a couple of questions that came up, and then we're going to move to the panel. So the first question that folks brought up is, do you think that people doing the work have a responsibility to communicate that versus keeping it to themselves? Bragging is definitely inappropriate, but I worry that silence communicates the issue as unimportant. Yeah, I think you just have to kind of find a distinction between the reasoning. So if you're sharing the work because you want to invite folks in and you want to encourage them to join you, it's a little bit different than just bragging. So I think really thinking about the intention behind it. And then someone says, I'm still grappling with ally versus accomplice in the same way that allyship is a moment-to-moment practice that can't be self-defined. Is accomplishship the same? Is it possible to practice accomplishship at all times, or is it more active pursuit than allyship? It's a great question. I think that we get sort of caught up in the language of it, and I think the fundamental purpose is to think about what actual change are you working toward. If you are engaging in something that's actively trying to create some kind of change, systemic or otherwise, policy, practice, behavioral change, and it's a consistent practice, then it's really important, and also in relationship and in solidarity with folks who are the most impacted by that issue. So I agree. I don't think accomplishship is self-defined. I think you show up and you let others define how you're showing up. And really the purpose, I think, is behind asking, what are you risking? So really thinking about some of those elements too. I want to make sure that we have time for our panelists. So we have Johanna, who's joining us from the library and is a community organizer. And then we have Andrew and Queen, who are part of the BIPOC Alliance. And I just want to welcome you all and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you for being here. Do you all want to say anything else in introduction about who you are and the work that you do for the folks that are joining us on the call?
Yeah, I can,
sure.
Start. I am part of the Poudre Public Library District. I work with the Community Service Department, and I am a community organizer and a community leader for many years here in Fort Collins, and my work has been around social and racial justice. I've also been a professor at CSU teaching dismantling oppression for a while. I am an immigrant to this country. I came to this country as a grown woman. I was already in 24, 25 the first time I came to this country. And I'm a mom of 2 kids, and yeah, I work in the community a lot.
Great, thank you. Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Andrew. One of the co-founders of BIPOC Alliance, and we've been just recently formed in Larimer County, trying to serve as a BIPOC-led voice, representing ourselves in a way that hasn't really been done in Fort Collins. Usually we've been represented by a lot of really, really well-meaning white people, but we figured it was time for us to speak with our own voice.
Thank you. And Queen, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Queen. I am also one of the founders of the BIPOC Alliance. I'm a community member, a single grandparent here. I've lived here 12 years in Fort Collins, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I sit on a few boards, the Healthy Larimer Committee, Family Voice Council, School Accountability District Advisory Board. Just to have my voice heard. I'm also the founder of 2 nonprofits here in Fort Collins, which are Queen's Legacy Foundation and New Eyes Village. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. All right, so it looks like we have someone else who joined us. Your name on the video says Queen, but do you want to introduce yourself?
Demetrius, that's you.
Demetrius, can you hear me? I don't know if he can hear. Oh, it looks like maybe he got frozen. Okay.
No, I'm not.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. My name is Demetrius Langston. I'm moving around. I'm Queen's eldest son. I am a realtor here in Colorado. My family, we've been here for about 12 years now. I'm also an associate of the BIPOC Alliance. I'm a board member of New Eyes Village and Queen's Legacy Foundation. I graduated from Poudre High School in 2009. I have all of my brothers under me have been, through the system, whether it be Poudre School District, whether it be the court system, we've definitely been through the ins and outs in Fort Collins. We have our experiences. We are very active members in the community, whether it be Fort Collins, out down in Denver, where I live. I think this is a very necessary conversation. I'm glad we're starting to have the necessary conversations that we need to have. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here on a Thursday afternoon, I'm sure after long days. So thank you so much for your energy and your space today. The first question that we have for you all is, how do you perceive allyship in Fort Collins? So just some thoughts about allyship and how that shows up, or how you would like it to show up in Fort Collins.
Before I answer that question, I want to make sure that people understand I'm not representing the views of the place that I work for or the places that I work for. I'm representing myself. The answers that I'm going to give are hyper-localized. They're my experience. I don't represent all the Latinos in Fort Collins. I don't represent all the immigrants in Fort Collins. It's my experience. And there is shared experience in that as well. So please take that with a grain of salt. I think allyship in Fort Collins is getting better. I have to say there is a lot of the stuff that you were talking and describing of being performative. We have seen that a lot. Unfortunately, every time a tragedy at the national level happens, we see a lot of momentum and energy, and then it kind of fizzles out and people just pretty much disappears. So I have seen that. The other piece is that there is pieces of being an activist and an ally or an accomplice that can feel really invigorating, like going to a march, like that feels really invigorating. But the actual work of racial and social justice is not that sexy. There is a lot of meetings, there is late meetings, there is conversations, there is talking with people every day, there is reading the city budget, reading many documents. So I wanna say that when you're thinking about being an ally or being an accomplice, is that what is that level of intention that you have, and what is the level of like your willingness of being this far in the long haul. So I do have to say I have experienced allyship and accomplices in the last 4 months in a way that I haven't in all the years that I have been in Fort Collins. And I have been speechless in ways that, again, that I have never seen before, which makes me grateful, and it makes me cautious because I hope it doesn't end. I have seen a lot of our white allies showing up in incredible, solid ways. And I will let the other panelists also talk about why allyship in Fort Collins.
Me?
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Kind of like Johanna said, I don't represent nobody but myself. This is all from me. And I do agree with a lot of what Johanna said as far as the support and the outreach and, the noise that's being made. Personally, it's real interesting to me, right? So the question is, how do you perceive it? And my answer is I don't necessarily perceive it. There's really no way for me to, kind of gauge it, because there's never been, this is the first time it's happened, right? And I don't want, as far as allyship, I don't necessarily want, someone to feel like they're being an ally to me just because they're doing what I told them to do, or doing what, I might feel like that's not the point. An ally for me is understanding, the issues and knowing what needs to be done and doing what you feel is right, relative to whatever is going on. So I think, that probably would be my answer to that question. Again, I am, like Johanna said, astounded and shocked at all the love and support and how much noise has been made. I can't help, I'd be lying if I said I couldn't help feel like, the situation that the world is in right now with the pandemic and everything, it really allowed people, because nobody can do anything. So I feel like it really allowed people to, an opportunity to kind of see what's really going on and give them something to stand behind. So I do love it and I appreciate it, but that's my view on it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Andrew or Queen, you want to add something?
I'm going to kind of piggyback off of my eldest son. We've been here for 12 years. Immediately started suffering in school to prison pipeline. And it wasn't, right now it's bittersweet. It wasn't until another great man was lost, calling his mother in the street while being killed, that this momentum has picked up. And it is a little, I don't know, scary to me, because it's like, oh yeah, we're here, we support you for the moment. But honestly, the whole 12 years I've been here, Heather, we've been dealing with racism, systems in the schools, at the doctor's office. I was called a monkey at the library. So, I mean, and it's like, it's only because of what happened to another great brother that we have all of this support. So I don't, allyship is something that, yeah, that's how I perceive allyship. Yeah. Andrew?
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to specifically get at the angle where touching again on allyship from the top has looked a lot like making decisions for us without our input. And I do see that changing, especially, as Queen said, in the aftermath of the loss of another brother. But it really, not making decisions for us, not speaking for us, but, going out of their way to offer up platforms, making space on the boards, at the city level, that sort of thing, that has been picking up very recently. And so that's where my perception is now. But as before, like you were just talking about, the savior complex was kind of what had been happening, and what still needs to get worked out a little bit.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing that. I appreciate your thoughts, and sharing that with the folks that are listening. And speaking a little bit to some of what you're talking about, which is sort of like, Johanna, I think you brought up, bringing, like, folks show up and then they sort of like disappear. And then the rest of y'all, Queen and Demetrius, were talking about, like, when people show up, when they choose to show up, and sort of under what circumstances. And so one of the questions that I had was, there's discomfort in allyship sometimes, and there's challenge with that. And so how do you think that allies can be in that space? Like, what are your sort of thoughts about being in the space of some discomfort around that? Yeah, Queen.
So first, there's discomfort here. Let that be known. Before this platform even existed, for anyone here, my oldest son was watching all of his siblings, so I can go to Aspen, Red Feather, all of these different places to have platforms at a higher level, for my voice to be heard. That was uncomfortable. That was uncomfortable. Walking into a school knowing that for the next 3 years, my child is going to be treated differently than the majority of the other children, that is uncomfortable. Now, when you talk about white allyship and being uncomfortable in spaces, that's what you have to do. It is what it is. That's what we had to do to be resilient. When they say, oh, you gotta pull yourselves up by your bootstrap, you know, in order for us to be resilient, we had to be uncomfortable first. So it's vice versa. You need to put yourself in those places to be very uncomfortable around those cultures and nations of people.
Thank you.
Johanna?
I agree with what Queen said. It is uncomfortable to be in a Black and a brown in an indigenous body in white supremacy spaces, and they're everywhere. So when we go to the store, when we go to the school, when we go to university, when we go to work, when we're in a meeting, when we're in a Zoom meeting, when we're just being outside our homes, it's not just uncomfortable, it's unsafe. So, and in different degrees for our Black brothers and sisters, from indigenous brothers and sisters, it's just not uncomfortable, it's unsafe, and we have to learn how to navigate that from a very early age. I have shared with many people here the experience that I had last year with my son. My son is on the spectrum, and he was accused of stealing books at school. And though I work at the library and I have many books in my house, and then the vice principal was saying things to my kid like, we're gonna look at the video and we're gonna see, because we have a video, and we're gonna show you that you took the books. And my son said, great, I wanna see the video because I didn't. But how many times this happens and kids end up accepting things that they didn't do, and they end up calling the police. I mean, like, all is beyond being uncomfortable. So I understand that in white supremacy, you wanna be perfect and you wanna be exact and you wanna have the right answer. And that's not how the rest of the world navigate lives. We don't have the perfect answer all the time. We are doing community work at the same time we're being traumatized by the system. So it is beyond uncomfortable, and yet we show up every single day. I can say that the 4 panelists we have here today, we work 60, 70 hours a week, and it's uncomfortable and it's dangerous and it's hard and it's heartbreaking, and we have to do it. So if we can do that work, so can you.
I definitely want to say that part of the biggest problem that we've got right now is that the model of policing that exists is values white comfort over Black lives. You know, like the classic Trayvon Martin walking through the neighborhood getting, you know, he made a white guy uncomfortable and ended up dead because of it. That's the fact that allyship is uncomfortable is it's the way we didn't want it to be like this. We're uncomfortable all the time, you know, standing next to and standing up with people of color shouldn't be uncomfortable, but it is, because the system all around us is made to completely avoid discomfort and and prop up the idea of being comfortable at all times, and always at the expense of people of color. And so get uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you. Demetrius, did you want to add anything?
You know, I think for the most part, everyone kind of touched on everything. As far as, you know, the allyship being uncomfortable, the fact that, you know, being an ally to Black people, to Hispanic people, Latinx people, the fact that an allyship is uncomfortable should let you know that there's a problem. That's a problem in itself. You know, like that should let you know that there's an issue that we need to take care of, because it shouldn't be uncomfortable for you to support me. You know, especially when it comes to like my actual life, not my business, not, you know, a sporting event, like my real life, my rights and my right to life. It shouldn't be uncomfortable for you to support me and stand by me or be associated with me or sing with me because of, you know, how it's going to look to your people or your group or your class, whatever it is. So like I said, I think, you know, everyone else kind of took care of it, but the fact that you know, there is discomfort in being an ally is a problem. So.
Thank you. So another question is just, is there work or ideas or things that can help white folks who are seeking to be in allyship or solidarity that they can be more active in? So current work that you're working on, or things where you think it would be helpful for folks to be showing up based on the BIPOC Alliance work and other things that are happening in Fort Collins.
I'm gonna answer that question with what not to do, and then I'll let the other panelists to answer with what to do. Something that we have seen here in Fort Collins is the sense of urgency. So every time something happens, we have a lot of very well-intended, nice groups of white people just coming out of everywhere, creating groups, creating alliances, starting nonprofit organizations, without really taking the time to see, are they grassroots organizations leading by people of color who are doing this work? Am I duplicating services? Am I taking resources from other people? Just stop, take the time, do your work, do the reading, watch the documentaries, which leads me to the second question, to the second piece of what not to do. What I have participated in Fort Collins panels, stories, stand-ups, ad nauseum, and it always comes disguised as we didn't know. I didn't know there was racism in Fort Collins. I didn't know these things were happening. And the reality is, as a collective, we people of color have done documentaries, books, poetry, spoken word, songs, anything for your consumption, so you know what's going on. So anytime something happens in Fort Collins and we get I never heard about this, it's because you didn't want to. It's as simple as that. So every time that happens and we get invited to tell our sad story and to tell the awful things that we go through, that is traumatizing again. And so think, why are you doing that? What is the point of you showing our stories and our trauma for the consumption? What is the point of that? If you have a clear, and it should be talked to with the person that you're inviting, will you like to do this? And the end result of this is this. And if your answer is, because I want more people to be aware of what's going on, really make a book club, invite your friends, show them the documentary, show them the videos. Now we have even TikToks, so they're like super short, before you continue to parading our stories for your benefit. And then the last piece is then pay us. The experiences that we're talking about, and if you're thinking about in capitalistic ways, there is great articles by Josso, Y-O-S-S-O, that talks about social capital. My experience, the way I can think, the way I can switch between different cultures and different codes should be paid for. You pay other consultants to bring their experience, their expertise, and their knowledge. We should too. We talk about, with my friends, we have I think that we talk about how many gift cards we have received in Fort Collins and for how many places. And we have almost like a bingo. Did you receive already the gift card to the Old Town, blah, 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 check it. Did you receive the gift card? You wouldn't do that with a white consultant. You will never, ever bring a white consultant to your place of work or your church and say, here is a $25 gift card, which we have had start conversations among ourselves saying that's what we're gonna do with white people now. When they invite us to something, we're gonna be like, here is your $25 gift card, thank you so much. So that's what not to do. And then I'll get off my soap opera and let the other panelists talk about what to do.
I want to jump in real quick and say one of the things that you can do right now, there's a link in the chat to the engagement form for volunteering with the BIPOC Alliance. And specifically, when you go down that list, there is a box to click if you're interested in being on the White Solidarity team. And they've been excellent in helping us in all manner of ways with the education piece, fielding the question, how can we help working on fundraising, offering different services in all kinds of fields. So that'd be a very immediate step that you can take, offering your time and services by following that link.
Andrew, I think a couple of people were saying they couldn't access it, but I think Rory, there we go.
Yeah, I think
Rory. I was gonna say, allow us time, space, opportunity to be successful. Here's the thing, in order to be successful, we need to fail. So we also need the space and opportunity to do that as well. Think about those things: space, time, opportunity for BIPOC children, youth, and families to come together and talk about their lives, their concerns, and how they can raise up one another. Demetrius?
I mean, I think for the most part, y'all pretty much summed it up really well. And I completely agree, you know, financially, resources, I would say, you know, support out in the open. That's my thing. And be genuine with the things you say. If you really, you know what I mean, want to be an ally and it's not part-time and you're not doing it so it looks good for your business, you know what I mean, or your friends or whatever it is, then if it's real, then do that. And if it's not, then just don't, just stay away, you know. And if you really mean it, then get educated. You know, don't discredit what I'm saying because it's not real to you. Just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean it's not real for somebody else, you know. And I think that's the biggest thing. So education and you know, public support. The same way, you know, the same way when, you know, we have Black people dying all the time. And the reason that these laws get changed is because there's so much public support. Now, Black people have been making noise, you know, forever for the same things. And while it takes us a lot longer to get results, as you notice, you know, when there's a lot of white people involved, things tend to happen really quick. You know, it's hard to ignore. And I think when you have that open public support, you know, I think it makes it very, very hard to, you know, refute the facts. And I think that's really, really necessary. I think factually, like, the facts are necessary. We need the space, we need the finances, we need the resources, we need all the love that we give to everyone else. And
I just want to throw one more thing in. You know, personally, raise justice up on your priority list. So when you go to the ballot box and there's someone you like his economic policies, but dude's real okay with putting children in cages, put the kids in cages higher on your priority list. And by doing so, that's actually showing up.
And if I can just throw something else in really fast, how can you support opportunities for people of color? Support our alliance, support Black organizations, because we are taking care of our communities. I'm not saying that, you know, these other great organizations, over 3,000 in the Fort Collins, aren't doing that. What I am saying is, when you have BIPOC alliances and Black organizations, they are more than likely focused on those communities. And the financial support helps us help those families.
Thank you all so much for sharing. There's somebody in the Q&A that mentioned that they are someone who identifies as Asian and live in Fort Collins, and said something similar to what you said, Johanna, which is that white people are not only showing up once for a diversity event, but constantly engaging and learning from us, and that there's just this tiredness of our lives and sharing our story all the time. So just reiterating that from an experience of someone on the call.
That was, yeah, Johanna, I definitely wanted to give, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Heather.
No, you're fine.
That's exactly what yeah, Johanna, I appreciate you saying that, because it's so tiring, you know, it's just like, it's so exhausting. Oh, tell me about being Black. I'm always explaining. I'm always having to explain what being Black is like. You know, it's like, it's like, oh, I seen this on TV. I heard about this. Oh, I'm so sorry for you. No, you're not. You know what I mean? Like that. You don't even know my name. You're not going to take 2 seconds to get to know it. You know, I don't need the fake sympathy, but yeah, it's really, really exhausting. You know, just explaining, like I said, what it's like being Black, or I can imagine what it's like to be Latin or Hispanic, anyone who's not white, you know what I mean? And that's where I think the education comes in, man. That's a huge piece. I think education is a huge piece. But yeah, sorry.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's, I really appreciate you all taking the time today, because this is yet another time when you're asked to kind of talk about this. And so I really acknowledge and appreciate the time and energy it takes to be here and to share even your thoughts about this and the engagement piece. So I really appreciate it. I have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I did want to ask generally about how you see allyship amongst BIPOC folks in the community, like the relationship in that community around what allyship shows up as in Fort Collins.
Yeah, so that's why and I will let Quinn and Andrew answer more about why the need for the BIPOC Alliance, but I think allyship, so Western imperialism and colonialism and white supremacy has really made an art of putting people of color, putting Blacks and Indigenous against each other. So that's part of the system. It has been created with a very specific purpose, and it's that if we're fighting with each other, then we're not aligning our agendas and working together. It works very well. And in Fort Collins, we have never had an alliance before. We have not worked together in our agendas. And how does it look like? It's not work, because I want to say it's a lot of work, because it means that you have to put time in it, but it's not work. Like, I truly, from the bottom of my heart and my soul, enjoy working with my Black brothers and sisters in Fort Collins. I love working with Indigenous people. I love working with many immigrants, Latinx communities. That's something that I truly, I feel at home. I don't have to be code switching. I don't have to be thinking about all these ways that I'm being evaluated. And the way that I keep thinking about it is that my existence shouldn't be evaluated by white standards. And when with my BIPOC brothers and sisters, that's how I feel. I don't feel evaluated by white standards. I don't feel like if I fail, they're gonna come at me and be like, it's a lot of kindness and grace, and knowing that we all have different struggles, and yet the same is the same. It's white supremacy and imperialism and colonialism bringing us down, tearing us down, trying to take our humanity away, and we continue to fight all the time to remind people that that's not possible. So yeah.
I'm gonna have
Quinn, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I'm gonna have to agree with Johanna. It's not really work, but then it's work. Like within the Black community, because in our lineage, it's been that, remove the family, just removed from one another. It's been a little difficult trying to get the community to understand that we have this space and we have this opportunity. We can come together and we can have our voices heard. And it's still very surreal to them because they still are dealing with those things daily.
You got muted again.
I have big fingers. But to be able to go into my Indigenous community and my communities of color, those families, and sit down and celebrate and talk about our similarities and struggle, it's comforting. It feels good. So that's why it is work, but it's not work. And I'm glad that it's being done. Johanna is a woman that's been in this community trying to, and I say trying really hard. I'm glad she has us now, but trying to build that alliance. And I'm glad she found us. And thank you for all of the hard work you've been putting into this community over the years, Johanna. Seriously, had it not been for you, we truly would not be raised up the way we are in wisdom. So thank you for your wisdom, sister. Thank you.
I'm comfortable. Andrew, talk. Andrew, please.
I was going to say, does anybody else want to add to that conversation about the allyship amongst the BIPOC Alliance folks?
I want to just agree with everything that's already been said, and you know, it's the reason we decided to be BIPOC Alliance was because of this piece, because of the indoctrination into tribalism, the idea that, you know, that we're separate and we gotta, you know, we is defined, you know, by the system that was put in place. You know, and that goes all the way back to the, you know, there were laws defining what it meant to be Black. You know what I mean? There, you know, get all the way to the Constitution, that very, very imperfect document. But you know, the one drop of Negro blood, you know, like that's how they defined us. And trying to make a space in this alliance where we can define ourselves and decide that we don't need to be separate and alone and compartmentalized in our struggle. We don't have to follow that model. And you know, we came together, you know, immediately after the, you know, George Floyd was killed. It wasn't, you know, oh man, he's Black and I'm Black. It's we're under attack. And you know, like the struggle for the Latinx in Larimer County is not altogether that different from the struggle of the Asian Pacific Islanders and the Black population and the indigenous populations here. We are all getting beat down by you know, and our similarities outweigh our differences. So that's where allyship, and that's why alliance, and that's why coalition building is our focus.
Thank you all so much. We have a couple of questions in the chat. A lot of thank yous for your time and energy and labor. Requests for links to donating to the BIPOC Alliance. So I know Johanna and I talked about this earlier. I think the website's up Friday, tomorrow. So I think folks can get access to that and search for that. But in the meantime, if you all have a donation link, let us know. We can put it in the chat. And then there's one question about the election. So with the election looming, does the BIPOC Alliance know of a good resource where political candidates have been vetted in terms of racial justice, so folks can have some of that information as they're voting?
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in with the answer to the other question about donation. I do have a link here. Our fiscal sponsor is the Foothills Unitarian, and they have a link set up for us. And also, if you need receipts or anything like that for your charitable donations, they will be able to give that to you.
Great, thank you so much.
And also, you can go to my website, Queen's Legacy Foundation or New Eyes Village, and there's a donate button there as well.
Yeah, someone just asked in the chat if we could get the name of your organizations as well. So yeah.
My apologies, sure.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
To answer the other question about yes, so one of the areas of work, and that will be in the website tomorrow for the BIPOC Alliance, is positions of power and legislation. So I think part of the work that the Alliance is going to be doing is for the candidates, what are they standing for? I don't think the Alliance can per se lobby or support an individual candidate, but they're having conversations with people who are running for different seats. And then the ultimate goal from the Alliance is to prepare people of color, BIPOC people, to run in 2, 5, 10 years. So part of the conundrum here is that we have, as people of color, allowed others to represent us for way too long. And I think it is time for us to be at the table making the decisions and running for office and having, making decisions for ourselves and for our communities.
And while we can't endorse candidates directly, we will definitely have on our website positions about platform stances that need to be taken, statements that we want to hear from the various candidates from the various positions about issues that do affect BIPOC populations.
Great, thank you.
And I have to make a shameless plug for the library. We are having this series, and we're also having Information is Power. So this Saturday, for example, we are going to have an informational forum on city budget and what that means. So please participate, ask questions. And then next week on Thursday, we're going to have an informational forum with the school district to talk about what are the changes and things that are happening right now with the school district. Stay tuned, we will share that. And then from your feedback in the last 2 weeks ago, we will have a series on how can we raise children that are conscientious of race and different. We will have a series for that. Stay tuned, we will share that with all of you. And then lastly, also, I want to just say to both Queen, Demetrius, and Andrew, I really appreciate the amount of work. I'm thankful for you being in this community. You are incredible community leaders. You give me hope. You give me, yes, just respite. So I'm so thankful for you being here, sharing with us. Somebody asked on the chat, are we being remunerated for our time here? And the answer is yes. It will be a longer answer, but the answer is yes. We walk the talk. I think that's the expression.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you all so much. We didn't get to all the questions, but want to be thoughtful of your all's time. And I just want to thank everyone who's joined us over the last 4 weeks. I really appreciate the time and energy folks have put into committing to be here. For everyone who supported me in the chat background and monitoring chat. Mark, who's our amazing tech person, who's been really incredible at helping support the back end of this. And just all of you for your time and energy. I just so appreciate it. And thank you, Johanna, for bringing me and trusting me with this. I really appreciate your confidence in my ability to hold this space and look forward to hopefully connecting with folks in Fort Collins in the future.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, and stay tuned. We will be hosting other series. And yes, please support Quiz Foundation, New Ice Village, support Black business, Latinx business. There is a great tamale place in college, so go and eat tamales. So anyways, have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Support BIPOC Alliance as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All of you. Thank you.
And I personally wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't let everyone on here know that, yes, I am a real estate agent here in Colorado. So anyone looking to buy, sell, or invest in commercial or residential real estate, I'm the guy. I got all my information. Look me up. Y'all know how to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
He's a New Yorker. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it all. Thank you so much. We'll see you all soon.